Captain Edward Ruppelt is sitting at the back of a secure conference room at the Pentagon. It is the afternoon of January 14th, 1953. Ruppelt is 29 years old. 2 distinguished flying crosses on his chest, aeronautical engineering degree from Iowa State, 18 months of building the most serious investigation the United States Air Force has ever run into what the public calls flying saucers. He coined the term they would use instead, unidentified flying object. 3 words, neutral and precise. The projector in the room is running a film. The film was shot on the 2nd of July, 1952, by Chief Warrant Officer Delbert C. Newhouse of the United States Navy. Newhouse was a naval photographer with more than 20 years of experience behind a motion picture camera. The film shows a formation of bright objects moving in the sky over Tremonton, Utah. The Navy's Photographic Analysis Unit has spent more than 1,000 man-hours on it. The Navy's conclusion, delivered to the panel in writing, is that the objects on the film are not any known aircraft, creature, or weather phenomenon. The film ends. The room discusses it. 5 physicists in chairs at the front of the room decide, in the time it took to watch the film, that the objects are sunlight reflecting off seagulls. The next reel goes on. The Great Falls, Montana film from the 15th of August, 1950. 2 bright disc-shaped objects moving in formation. The Navy's conclusion again, not any known phenomenon. The panel's conclusion, sunlight reflecting off Air Force interceptor jets known to have been in the area. 18 months earlier, Ruppelt had taken over the Air Force's UFO investigation and fired every staff member who walked in with the answer already in their pocket. Committed believers in extraterrestrial spacecraft, gone. Committed debunkers, gone. The investigation would follow the evidence, or the people running it would not be running it. He is now watching the most distinguished panel of applied physicists in the United States do exactly what he had fired people for. He has built the investigation. He is watching it end.
This is Unresolved Signals, an AI-powered investigation into the oldest open question in human history. Every document, every country, every question, every release.
Every source cited in this episode is linked on our source page at unresolvedsignals.com. The primary sources for this episode include the Durant Report, the official proceedings of the panel compiled by CIA officer Frederick C. Durant, the panel's final report signed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, Gerald Haines' article titled CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs, 1947 to 1990, published in the agency's own journal, Studies in Intelligence. Physicist James E. McDonald's testimony and lectures on the panel from the late 1960s. Historian David M. Jacobs' 1975 book, The UFO Controversy in America. Air Force Regulation 200-2, issued February 1953. Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, issued December 1953, and Captain Ruppelt's own book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, published in 1956. All of these documents are declassified and publicly available. To understand what Captain Ruppelt was watching in that room, you have to understand what he had built. Last episode, we told the story of Project Blue Book's first 18 months. Ruppelt established the project at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in March of 1952. He created the first standardized witness questionnaire so that reports from every base could be compared and analyzed. He was granted authority to interview any military personnel anywhere, bypassing the normal chain of command. He commissioned the Battelle Memorial Institute, an independent research organization in Columbus, Ohio, to run the numbers on every sighting the Air Force had collected. Battelle's final report, published in 1954 as Special Report Number 14, ran to 316 pages. Of 3,201 cases analyzed, 21.5% were classified unknown after exhaustive review. The chi-square statistical test, applied to the 6 measured characteristics of known and unknown cases, found a probability of less than 1 in a billion that the 2 groups came from the same statistical population. Less than 1 in a billion. And then the summer of 1952 happened. The wave. Unidentified targets over Washington, D.C. on the 19th and 20th of July. Again on the 26th and 27th. 3 independent radar systems. Interceptors scrambled. A combat pilot at maximum speed who reported no closing speed on the objects he was trying to catch. The Washington wave turned the UFO question into a national security question in a way it had never been before. Blue Book received approximately 1,500 sighting reports that year, 250 in July alone. And the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been watching from a distance since the late 1940s, decided the situation had become a problem it could no longer watch. That decision had a name. His name was H. Marshall Chadwell. Chadwell was the assistant director of the Office of Scientific Intelligence at the CIA. He spent the second half of 1952 reviewing the UFO reports that were accumulating on Air Force desks and on his own. In December of 1952, Chadwell delivered a briefing to the Director of Central Intelligence, Walter Bedell Smith. His language was blunt. Something was going on that required immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major United States defense installations were of such a nature that they were not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. Those are Chadwell's words. In a CIA memorandum in December of 1952, Chadwell laid out two specific dangers. The first was psychological warfare. American credulity about objects in the sky could be exploited by the Soviets to, quote, touch off mass hysteria and panic. The second was air defense vulnerability. A flood of UFO reports could overload the United States early warning system at exactly the moment the Soviets launched a nuclear first strike. Chadwell's framing of the question to Smith was surgical. At the moment of attack, how will we on an instant basis distinguish hardware from phantom? CIA analysts had also noticed something curious. The Soviet press carried no UFO reports at all. Agency analysts concluded this was deliberate government policy, possibly an indication that Moscow was already thinking about how to exploit the phenomenon against Washington. Smith agreed the situation had to be resolved. In his own words, he believed there was only one chance in 10,000 that the phenomenon posed a direct threat to the security of the country. But even that chance, he said, could not be taken. Smith also wanted to know what use could be made of the UFO phenomenon in connection with United States psychological warfare efforts. The question on the table at the CIA in December of 1952 was no longer whether the objects were real. The question was whether the reports could be weaponized against the United States, and whether they could be weaponized by it. Chadwell moved quickly. He drafted a memorandum from the Director of Central Intelligence to the National Security Council. He proposed an NSC intelligence directive making UFO investigation a priority project across the intelligence community. Before that could go forward, he wanted a scientific review. He asked the Intelligence Advisory Committee for a recommendation, and the committee advised enlisting selected scientists to appraise the evidence. Gerald Haines, in the CIA's own published history, uses a specific phrase to describe what Chadwell did next. He writes that Chadwell, quote, clandestinely sponsored, end quote, the panel that would do the appraising. The chair was Dr. H.P. Robertson, physicist, California Institute of Technology, director of the Defense Department Weapons Evaluation Group, and a CIA consultant of long standing. Robertson personally reviewed the Air Force files before the panel convened. The other panelists were four of the most distinguished applied physicists in the country: Dr. Luis W. Alvarez of the University of California, radar expert, later a Nobel laureate; Dr. Lloyd V. Berkner, geophysicist, director of Brookhaven National Laboratories; Dr. Samuel A. Goudsmit, nuclear physicist, also at Brookhaven; Dr. Thornton L. Page, astrophysicist, deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Operations Research Office. Two associate members sat in as well. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had consulted with the Air Force's UFO projects from their earliest days, was invited to present, but not to vote. And Frederick C. Durant, a CIA officer and missiles expert, served as secretary. His notes would become the primary record of what happened in the room. The CIA was represented directly at the table: Chadwell himself, his deputy Ralph L. Clark, Philip G. Strong. The Air Force sent two observers, Brigadier General William Garland, chief of the Air Technical Intelligence Center, and Captain Edward Ruppelt, director of Project Blue Book. Ruppelt had spent the previous 18 months building the investigation. He was now about to watch 5 men, in 12 hours, evaluate 6 years of evidence. The panel met on the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th of January 1953. 2 working days of case review, 2 days of summarizing and drafting. Total formal meeting time, approximately 12 hours. The Air Technical Intelligence Center had selected 75 case histories from the 1951 and 1952 files as the best documented available. Of those, 23 were examined in detail. 23 out of 2,331 cases in the Air Force files. 1% of the data. The Tremonton film was one of them. We know what the panel concluded: seagulls. The Great Falls film was another. The panel concluded Air Force interceptors, despite the fact that the Air Force had already checked its own flight records and found none in the area at the time. Major Dewey Fournay, a former Blue Book project officer and a trained aeronautical engineer, presented the panel with a document he had personally spent months preparing. Fournay had systematically eliminated each known cause of UFO sightings, case by case, category by category. What remained in his analysis was an extraterrestrial hypothesis that could not be ruled out by the evidence in hand. The panel rejected Fournet's analysis on the grounds that the cases he had relied on were, in their words, raw, unevaluated reports. And then there was Hynek. Hynek was the only person in the room with 5 years of direct UFO investigation experience. He had walked the ground. He had interviewed witnesses. He knew the files. He knew which cases the Air Technical Intelligence Center had not put in front of the panel. He did not speak up. 13 years later, asked in an interview why he had not challenged the dismissals he was watching, Hynek gave his answer. He said he was, quote, only small potatoes then. He said it would have been impossible for him to sway that eminent group. James McDonald, the University of Arizona physicist who would later go back through the panel's record in forensic detail, documented what Hynek had not said in the room. The panel had excluded from review some of the most significant cases already on file. The United Airlines sighting of 1947, the Childs Whitted case of 1948, the Nash Fortenberry case of 1952, most of the strongest radar visual cases from the wave that had triggered the panel in the first place. 23 cases out of 2,331. And inside that 1%, the strongest evidence in the files had been left outside the door. Ruppelt, at the back of the room, saw this happen. He understood what he was watching, and his authority inside that room was zero. On the 17th of January, the panel signed its findings. There were 3, and they were unanimous. First, the evidence presented on unidentified flying objects shows no indication that these phenomena constitute a direct physical threat to national security. Second, we firmly believe that there is no residuum of cases which indicates phenomena which are attributable to foreign artifacts capable of hostile acts. Third, there is no evidence that the phenomena indicates a need for the revision of current scientific concepts. On the face of it, these findings were reassuring. No threat, no Soviet secret weapon, no alien spacecraft, no revolution in physics. But the panel did identify a danger. The danger was the reports themselves. Quote, the continued emphasis on the reporting of these phenomena does, in these parlous times, result in a threat to the orderly functioning of the protective organs of the body politic. End quote. They listed specific risks. Misidentification of real enemy hardware by defense personnel. Overloading of emergency reporting channels with false information. Dr. Berkner coined a phrase for this, a phrase that would have a long career afterward, noise-to-signal ratio. And fourth on the list, quote, subjectivity of public to mass hysteria and greater vulnerability to possible enemy psychological warfare. The panel had found no physical threat. The panel had found a public relations threat. And the panel had a recommendation for what to do about it. The recommendation was the fourth, and it was the one Chadwell and his CIA colleagues in the room had specifically requested. The panel wrote that the national security agencies should take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they had been given and the aura of mystery they had unfortunately acquired. The mechanism was spelled out across several paragraphs of the final report, a broad educational program with 2 explicit components, training and debunking. On debunking, the panel's language was specific. The program would produce a, quote, reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. The content was to be, quote, actual case histories which had been puzzling at first but later explained. And then the analogy that sits at the center of the whole document. Quote, as in the case of conjuring tricks, there is much less stimulation if the secret is known. End quote. Conjuring tricks. The analogy the panel chose for the American public's reaction to unexplained objects in the sky. Explain the trick, and the audience stops watching. The panel named its recommended consultants. Dr. Hadley Cantrell of Princeton University, the psychologist who had written the definitive academic study of the 1938 Orson Welles radio broadcast of War of the Worlds and the public panic it produced. Arthur Godfrey, the most popular radio and television personality in the country. And Walt Disney Productions. Walt Disney was to be enlisted by name in a classified intelligence recommendation to help the United States government convince the American public that what it was seeing in the sky was not worth looking at. The training films themselves were to be produced, the panel proposed, by Army training film companies and the Navy's Special Devices Center. The mass audience content was to come through Hollywood. And then there was the surveillance language. The panel, in the report's own words, took cognizance of the existence of civilian UFO research groups. The Civilian Flying Saucer Investigators in Los Angeles, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization in Wisconsin. Quote, it was believed that such organizations should be watched because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking if widespread sightings should occur. The apparent irresponsibility and the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes should be kept in mind." End quote. The United States intelligence apparatus had just recommended, in writing, that private American citizens who investigated UFOs be monitored for subversive tendencies. It was January of 1953. Senator Joseph McCarthy was 3 weeks from becoming chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The word subversive in that month of that year carried the full weight of the apparatus that enforced it.
This episode is sponsored by What's Near Me Now. Visit nearmenow.us to find events near you.
Captain Ruppelt walked out of the Pentagon on the 17th of January with a clear view of what was coming. Air Force Regulation 200-2 was issued in February, less than 30 days after the panel adjourned. The regulation instructed that airbase officers could publicly discuss only solved UFO cases. All unsolved cases were to be classified. A UFO with a conventional explanation could be released to the press. A UFO without one could not. The asymmetry is worth pausing on. The cases the public most wanted to know about were the cases the Air Force was now forbidden to talk about. An updated version of the regulation was issued in August of 1954 over the signature of Nathan Twining, by then Air Force Chief of Staff. The update codified the new operating structure. The 4,602nd Air Intelligence Squadron was assigned to investigate UFO cases with national security implications. Project Blue Book was stripped of its investigative authority. Blue Book's job now was to reduce the number of unexplained cases to a minimum. Ruppelt had built an investigation. The Air Force had converted it into a public relations operation. In December of 1953, 11 months after the panel's report was signed, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, JANAP 146. Under a subheading titled Canadian-United States Communications Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings, abbreviated SERVICE, the publication made the unauthorized disclosure of UFO report information a crime under the Espionage Act of the United States. The penalties were up to 10 years in federal prison, or a fine of $10,000, or both. The regulation applied to every member of the armed services, every government employee with knowledge of the regulation, and commercial airline pilots. If a Pan-American captain flying over the Pacific saw something he could not identify, he could report it through military channels to NORAD, to Air Defense Command, to the nearest military installation. What he could not do, under threat of criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act, was tell a journalist, or mention it to his fellow pilots outside the reporting channel, or describe it publicly. Reports of unidentified flying objects were explicitly listed in JANAP 146, alongside the other categories of vital intelligence sightings: hostile aircraft, missiles, hostile submarines. The inclusion is striking. The panel had found no threat. The regulatory regime that followed treated UFO sightings as information of the same sensitivity as the approach of enemy forces. JANAP 146 remained in effect until December of 1969, 16 years. For 16 years, a commercial pilot who saw something unexplainable was legally required to keep it to himself. Inside Project Blue Book, the human consequence of the panel's recommendations played out across Ruppelt's staff. Ruppelt was temporarily reassigned in February of 1953. When he returned, his team of more than 10 investigators had been reduced to 2 subordinates. He recommended that the 4,602nd Air Intelligence Squadron take over the serious cases, because with 2 people on his bench, he could no longer investigate them himself. Then he left the Air Force. Major Fournet, who had presented the extraterrestrial hypothesis to the panel, was no longer involved. Al Chop, the Blue Book press officer, was no longer involved. Brigadier General Garland, who had personally seen a UFO and who had supported Ruppelt's overhaul 18 months earlier, never again raised his voice in defense of a UFO investigation. These are Ruppelt's words in his own book. In 1956, Ruppelt published that book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. It remains, 70 years later, the most detailed insider account ever written of a United States government UFO investigation. He named the cases. He named the people. He named what the panel had done and what it had cost the work. And then, in 1960, a second edition appeared. The original text was unchanged, but 3 new chapters had been added at the end, and in those chapters, Ruppelt reversed himself. UFOs, the new chapters argued, were a modern mythology, a space-age fantasy, a story the public had told itself. Ruppelt's widow, interviewed years later, attributed the reversal to pressure from his former superiors in the Air Force. Captain Edward Ruppelt died of a heart attack on the 15th of September, 1960. He was 37 years old. The one insider who might have said more never got the chance. The agency did something with its own role in the panel that would prove, over time, to be as consequential as the panel itself. Following the panel's findings, the CIA abandoned plans to escalate the UFO issue to the National Security Council. The Robertson panel report was classified, and inside the agency, according to Gerald Haines' official history, any mention of CIA sponsorship of the panel was forbidden, Haines' own words, in a CIA publication. That forbidden to mention sponsorship would become, in Haines' analysis, a major problem for the agency, a credibility problem that lasted for decades. Because what the CIA had directed the public to stop thinking about, the CIA could not afford to publicly admit it had directed. Donald Keyhoe saw this from the outside. Keyhoe was a retired Marine Corps major. He ran the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a civilian research group known by its acronym, NICAP. Over the years following the panel, Keyhoe assembled, from sympathetic Air Force personnel and from public records, most of the basic facts of what the panel had done: sightings, rumors of classified recommendations, the outline of the CIA's involvement. Keyhoe's interpretation was that the Air Force was blocking full disclosure to avoid public panic. His interpretation was wrong in one key respect. The panel had not been about preventing public panic. The panel had been about managing public perception. But Keyhoe's facts were basically correct, and the Air Force could not refute his interpretation without disclosing the rationale for its own actions, which was exactly what the CIA had forbidden. David Jacobs, the academic historian, summarized the result in a single sentence. The more the Air Force denied Keyhoe's conspiracy charge, the more it seemed to be covering up. The panel's secrecy created the very narrative it was designed to suppress. There was one more person in that Pentagon conference room whose story outlasted the panel. J. Allen Hynek walked out of the room in January of 1953 with the same information Ruppelt had. He knew what cases had been excluded. He knew what the panel had dismissed in minutes that the Navy had analyzed for months. He had watched the conjuring tricks analogy become government policy. He said nothing at the time. For the next 15 years, Hynek continued as the Air Force's paid scientific consultant on UFOs. He served the debunking regime the panel had built. He signed off on prosaic explanations for cases he privately suspected were not prosaic. In public, he was the skeptic the Air Force needed him to be. And then, slowly, he began to change. By the late 1960s, Hynek was speaking publicly about the inadequacy of Project Blue Book. By 1973, he had founded the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, to do the civilian research the government had stopped doing. He developed the Close Encounters classification system that Steven Spielberg would immortalize 4 years later. Hynek spent the last 25 years of his life trying to make up for the silence of January 14th through 17th, 1953. He was the witness who eventually bore witness. But he was also the man who, when it might have mattered most, told himself he was only small potatoes. He was in the room. He was the only person there who knew the files. He said nothing. Here's what we can state about the evidence in this episode. Confirmed. The Central Intelligence Agency convened a scientific panel on the 14th through 17th of January, 1953, chaired by Dr. H.P. Robertson, to review Air Force UFO evidence. 23 cases out of 2,331 in the files were reviewed in detail. The panel met for approximately 12 hours of formal case review. This is documented in the Durant Report, the panel's final report, and Gerald Haines' published CIA history. Confirmed. The panel unanimously concluded that the evidence showed no indication that UFOs constituted a direct physical threat to national security, no residuum of cases attributable to foreign artifacts, and no need for revision of current scientific concepts. The panel identified the reporting of UFOs, rather than the objects, as the operational risk. Confirmed. The panel recommended a broad educational program to strip UFOs of their special status and reduce public interest. The program was to include, quote, training and debunking. Recommended consultants included Dr. Hadley Cantrell of Princeton University, Arthur Godfrey, and Walt Disney Productions. Recommended producers included Army training film companies and the Navy's Special Devices Center. Civilian UFO research organizations were to be watched for possible, quote, subversive purposes. All of this is in the final report and the Durant Report. Confirmed. Air Force Regulation 200-2 was issued in February of 1953. It classified all unsolved UFO cases. The August 1954 revision transferred serious investigative responsibility to the 4,602nd Air Intelligence Squadron and directed Project Blue Book to reduce the number of unexplained cases to a minimum. Confirmed. Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146 was issued in December of 1953. It applied the Espionage Act to unauthorized disclosure of UFO sighting reports by military personnel, government employees, and commercial airline pilots. Penalties included up to 10 years in federal prison and fines of up to $10,000. The regulation remained in effect until December of 1969. Confirmed. The CIA's sponsorship of the Robertson panel was classified. Internal agency policy prohibited any mention of that sponsorship. This is documented by the CIA itself in Gerald Haines' official history, published in the agency's own journal. Confirmed. Captain Edward Ruppelt published his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, in 1956. A revised edition appeared in 1960, with 3 added chapters reversing his position. His widow later attributed that reversal to pressure from his superiors. Ruppelt died of a heart attack on the 15th of September 1960 at the age of 37. Probable. Hynek's later account that he did not challenge the panel's conclusions because he was, in his own words, only small potatoes then, is supported by his public statements from the 1960s onward. Whether other panel members had private reservations during the proceedings is not independently documented in the record. Here is what we do not know. Was the outcome of the panel predetermined before the panelists entered the room? Chadwell, the CIA officer who sponsored the panel, had spent 6 months urging his superiors that the UFO question required immediate intelligence community attention. All 5 voting members were skeptics of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Robertson personally reviewed the files before convening. The panel spent 12 hours on 1% of the data. Whether this was scientific review or a process designed to produce a specific recommendation is a question the record does not settle. What was in the 2,308 cases the panel did not review? The 75 cases presented were selected by the Air Technical Intelligence Center as, quote, best documented. McDonald demonstrated that several of the strongest cases on record were excluded from that selection. Who chose which cases were shown to the panel, and by what criteria, is a question the record does not answer. Did Walt Disney cooperate? The panel named Disney Productions by name. What the company's response was, whether training films were produced, whether the debunking campaign found its way into entertainment content of the 1950s and 1960s, is a question the record answers only partially. What did JANAP 146 prevent from being reported? For 16 years, commercial pilots and military personnel who witnessed unexplained phenomena faced federal prosecution for discussing them. How many witnesses were silenced by the regulation? How many sightings were never reported at all? The absence of testimony is itself the evidence of the regulation's effect. And the question the panel never had to answer. If the phenomenon genuinely posed no threat to national security, what explains the response? A classified document, a restrictive Air Force regulation, a criminal statute under the Espionage Act, a 16-year silence. That is the response of a government that has concluded the public cannot be trusted with whatever is being seen. In the summer of 1952, objects appeared on radar over the capital of the United States. 3 radar systems, restricted airspace, interceptors that could not close. The response took 6 months to take shape. It began in a meeting between a CIA officer and his director. It proceeded through the clandestine sponsorship of a panel of physicists. It passed through a secure conference room where the most distinguished applied scientists in the country spent 12 hours on 1% of the evidence. And it ended, by the close of 1953, with a regulation that classified the cases the public wanted to know about, and a criminal statute that made a commercial pilot's public report of something he could not explain an offense potentially punishable by 10 years in federal prison. The one man in that room who had done the honest work left the Air Force, wrote the book that told what he knew, and died at 37. The one man in that room who knew the cases said nothing, and spent 25 years trying to make up for it. Every source cited in this episode is linked at unresolvedsignals.com. The Durant Report is there. The final report of the panel is there. Air Force Regulation 200-2 is there. Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, declassified through the National Security Agency, is there. If you have a document we have not seen, a connection we missed, or a correction we need to make, the submission portal is open. The panel itself met for 4 days. What it produced remained on the books for 16 years. The policy instinct it expressed has not yet fully expired. Next time on Unresolved Signals, Blue Book, The Fall. A note on how this show is made. Unresolved Signals is produced using artificial intelligence and human editorial oversight. AI is a powerful research and production tool. It is also a tool that can and does make mistakes. We will do everything in our power to ensure that every detail we share is backed by real research and real sources. Our job is to find the connections across thousands of documents in dozens of languages that no single person could process alone. When we get something wrong, we will correct it publicly. Every source is linked at unresolvedsignals.com, where you can read the original documents yourself and check our work. If you'd like to sponsor this show or partner with Unresolved Signals, visit unresolvedsignals.com/sponsor.
Unresolved Signals is produced by Talentless AI, produced and directed by Steve Mudd, research compiled and cross-referenced using Google Notebook LM, narration generated by 11 Labs, research coordination, script writing, and source verification by Claude. Original source documents accessed through government archives, university collections, and public repositories worldwide. This has been Unresolved Signals. Every document, every country, every question, every release. This is Unresolved Signals. Next time, Blue Book, The Fall. 16 years of institutional decay, a university committee with a rigged assignment, and the moment the project's own scientist finally called it what it was.